The Falcon pipeline, meant to feed Shell's cracker plant, is bad news for the Ohio River Valley.
I am not scared if the pipeline will leak, but rather I am terrified of what will happen when it inevitably does.
Since Shell started its construction, the Falcon pipeline has had 70 spills, releasing at least 250,000 gallons of drilling fluid. If brought online, the Falcon will carry more than 107,000 barrels of ethane per day across West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, putting all of our communities at risk. The Falcon crosses directly below the Ohio River, threatening drinking water for more than 5 million residents.
The proposed pipeline route will run directly below the main water line leading out of the reservoir to the Ambridge treatment plant. And the pipeline will also cross watershed tributaries more than a dozen times.
The Ambridge Reservoir provides water to nearly 30,000 customers and is the authority's sole source of water. Losing the reservoir as a water source would have a devastating effect on numerous communities in both Beaver and Allegheny County.
The Falcon has been under investigation since 2019 for possible non-compliance with construction and public safety requirements.
When you place a pipeline in the Swiss cheese ground of Washington County, ground that has been mined out, drilled out, and for the purposes of laying a pipeline destabilized, you increase the risk of an incident.
I've been reading about Shell's incidents, an incident for every 18 miles of pipeline, and they're due to equipment failure, corrosion, welding failure, structural issues, or incorrect operations.
Pennsylvania's Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection, Patrick McDonnell, stated that these issues pose a possible threat of product release, landslide, or even explosion. The Falcon will transport ethane to make plastic, not heat homes, and will be the backbone of petrochemical development in the Ohio River Valley. This is a failing industry that hasn't delivered on its promise for economic gain, while putting millions of families at risk.
The pipeline is one component. There's extraction, there's fracking wastewater disposal or treatment.
Increased risk for asthma, cancer, cardiovascular disease, endocrine disruption, and birth defects.
My house lost much of its value just for being located in a frack zone.
The pipeline would create at most 1,000 temporary jobs, construction jobs, with only 4 to 6 permanent jobs.
If you add up the known subsidies, impacts from carbon dioxide, health impacts, the facility in Beaver County will be costing taxpayers over $6.1 billion.
We will keep showing up because no matter how many permits are approved, no matter how many pipelines are built, no matter how much plastic is manufactured, some things never change. It will always be worth resisting the destruction of our land, air, and water for the profits of a few.
Community members, landowners, and workers should get a say in our region's economic future. Sign our petition to demand that PHMSA hold a public meeting to address our concerns.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this public meeting on the Falcon Pipeline. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, including where you're from and what brought you here today. This meeting is being recorded. It's also being broadcast live on Facebook. My name is Carrie Pohl. I'm a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden, Pennsylvania. We're a group of sisters within the Roman Catholic tradition. Among the beliefs at the core of our identity is that creation, in all of its wondrous diversity, is a gift of God and requires our care and respect. As we are based in Beaver County, the majority of the sisters in our congregation receive service from the Ambridge Water Authority, which receives its water from the Ambridge Reservoir. In addition to crossing the raw water line leading from the reservoir to Ambridge, the Falcon pipeline also has several crossings with tributaries that feed into the reservoir. To say that we're concerned about how this might affect our drinking water is an understatement. Tonight's meeting was put together by the People Over Petro Coalition, a coalition of individuals and organizations working to advance the well-being of communities in the Ohio River Valley. It comes after years of organizing by countless individuals and organizations around this pipeline and the project it's connected to, the Shell ethane cracker plant. Thank you to all who have devoted so much time and energy into protecting your communities. Tonight, we'll start by covering what we know about the allegations against the Falcon Pipeline's construction, including brand new info just received today from regulatory officials. Then we'll discuss what's at stake if something were to go wrong with this pipeline when it's turned on, drawing on lessons from other pipeline projects in the region. You'll hear from a staunch Pennsylvania advocate who has been standing up to the petrochemical industry in her backyard for the past 6 years. Finally, we'll discuss the best practices for whistleblowers, including prohibited personnel practices and whistleblower laws. Then we'll have time for question and answers and for any of you to share your concerns about the Falcon at the end of our meeting. Please type your questions in the chat box and indicate which speaker you're directing the question to. We'll address the questions at the end of the meeting. If you don't get to them tonight, we'll make sure that they're recorded. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can send it directly to the chat moderator. I understand that we have representatives from both PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is the federal agency that oversees the Falcon safety and operation, as well as the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection at our meeting tonight. Welcome. They're here to listen, not to answer questions. Nonetheless, if any of the representatives from those agencies would like to answer a question, please send a note to the chat moderator and we'll give you space to do that. Thank you to the representatives from PHMSA, PADEP, and all other public officials who are joining us tonight to learn more about our concerns. People Over Petro Coalition is asking that PHMSA hold their own public hearing in response to tonight's event. If you have questions directed to PHMSA, we'll make note of these to address at the public hearing if PHMSA agrees to hold one. A couple housekeeping items to get out of the way. As I mentioned, this meeting is being recorded. It's also being live streamed on the People Over Petro's Facebook page. So if you'd like, search People Over Petro on Facebook and share it so that more people can see it. If you happen to be watching this on Facebook, please feel free to leave comments and questions there too. If you're having any technical issues or questions, please message our tech support person. You can do this by clicking chat at the bottom of your screen, go to where it says to everyone, change to everyone to tech support and type your concern. We ask that you make sure that you're on mute so that we can hear our speakers. You can mute and unmute by clicking the microphone button at the bottom of the screen. I think everybody's muted now. If someone shares their screen and you go into full screen mode, you can click the escape button to get out of that. As I said earlier, you can type questions directly into the chat for us to answer in the second portion of the meeting. The chat feature is at the bottom of the screen and will bring up a window to the right. The default setting is to message everyone. You can change that to direct message anyone. If you have issues with sound, there's an arrow next to the mute button that will let you select where you want your sound to come from, your computer, headphones, a telephone, whatever. We suggest viewing in speaker view, which you can select in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. If members of the media are present, I'd invite you to type your name and your outlet into the chat box. Tonight's speakers will include Erica Jackson, Manager of Community Outreach and Support at Frac Tracker Alliance, Tucker Harris, a landowner who lives along the Falcon route and has been impacted by this project, Terry Baumgartner with the Clean Air Council, the prominent Mariner East pipeline protester, Eleanor Gerhardt, Bob Schmetzer with Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community, Adam Arnold with Government Accountability Project, and Heaven Sensky with the Center for Coalfield Justice. We'll include more detailed bios of our speakers in the chat box as they're speaking. First up is Erica, the Manager of Community Outreach and Support with Frac Tracker Alliance. Welcome, Erica.
Thanks, Mr. Carey. I think we're going to also share some images, so I'll wait for those to appear. Like Sister Carey said, my name is Erica Jackson. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Pittsburgh, and I've been working at Frac Tracker for about the past 2.5 years, pretty much working on the Falcon since it started. So you can go to the next slide. So the Falcon pipeline carries ethane. It's a recently constructed pipeline project. Ethane is a type of gas. It's extracted from fracked wells in this part of the country, And the plan is to take ethane from these 3 purple processing facilities to the Shell ethane cracker, where it will be cracked into ethylene and then turned into polyethylene plastic. And that is the most common type of plastic used in packaging and bottles and bags. So it's important to note that the Falcon is designed to carry ethane and not methane, like the regular gas pipelines that are used for energy, because leaks of ethane are actually more dangerous than methane. Ethane is heavier than air and it pools in low-lying areas, which makes it easier for explosions to happen. And unlike methane, which has the odor added to it, ethane is colorless and odorless. So construction of the Falcon is largely complete, but there's still some restoration happening. Next slide. So whistleblowers began reporting concerns with the Falcon in July 2019. Shortly after construction began, they reported to the federal agency that oversees this project, which is PHMSA, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, that the pipeline may have been built with defective corrosion coating. Soon after, Pennsylvania officials began investigating issues as well and looking into these concerns. And early last year in 2020, the head of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, Secretary McDonnell, wrote this letter to the head of PHMSA, the federal agency, and basically stated that Pennsylvania believed that PHMSA was essentially not doing its job in looking into these concerns and that their inquiries were inadequate. This was a pretty shocking letter to read. McDonnell said that they found the whistleblowers' evidence credible, that these accusations mean the pipeline poses a risk of product release, landslide, or even explosion. And he said that Pennsylvania has additional evidence of other safety concerns, such as reports of construction incidents being falsified and retaliatory firings and quote unquote other actions by Shell, which is very vague. So we know a number of things are being investigated: the corrosion coating, possible reports being falsified, maybe whistleblowers being fired. And in Pennsylvania, they list this vague language that they're investigating compliance with construction and public safety requirements. And when this story broke about a month ago or a month and a half ago, investigations in Pennsylvania, including by the State Attorney General's Office and PHMSA, were ongoing. Despite the fact that the pipeline crosses West Virginia and Ohio, it doesn't look like those agencies have really been involved in this, which is a little concerning. Okay, next slide. So this past March, 29 regional and national environmental organizations, saw these concerns in this letter, were very concerned, and wrote a series of letters to regulatory agencies, basically calling for answers. Our main asks were just that these issues were thoroughly investigated. Construction was suspended while they were being investigated, or operation if construction was complete, and that independent testing of the pipeline's integrity would be done. And we also wanted all of this information to be public. We've heard a little bit of information back from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, but and we're grateful for that. But as of earlier today, we had not heard back from PHMSA. Again, that's the main agency in play here because they are the one that oversees the pipeline safe operation. However, just today, we do have some kind of exciting news, I guess, in that we did get a response back from that agency. Again, we sent these letters on March 17th. They wrote back today, May 4th, and the timing of that really proves that simply a group of concerned residents like you all, there are 92 of us here, showing up is enough to put some pressure on our public agencies to give us some answers. So thank you all just for showing up today and everyone who helped organize this meeting. Okay, next slide. So like I said, we just got these letters a few hours ago. This letter from PHMSA, we're still digesting this information and reading through it, but what we learned was basically PHMSA got these allegations from a whistleblower in 2019. It appears that that PHMSA conducted an investigation largely around photos of the Falcon pipeline. One photo showing a pipe with scratch marks on it, which PHMSA determined that the coating had indeed been damaged, but it did not constitute a safety issue. And then the other one showed damage to the pipeline coating from a horizontal directional drill. That's basically where the pipe is drilled horizontally under a sensitive location, like a road or a river. That's really concerning because there are 20 of these, at least 20 of these horizontal directional drills along the Falcon. So if there's an issue at one, there could be issues at others. And based on this, PHMSA could not substantiate the allegation. So that leaves us with a lot of questions about what happened. PHMSA also identified a case where Shell falsely reported a surface testing procedure. So Shell did not have a proper test strip, and that is used to determine if the pipe has been adequately sandblasted or cleaned. And they used an incorrect one, but they falsely reported that they used the correct one. Again, that raises a lot of concerns about Shell falsely reporting issues. But PHMSA stated that they responded to this. And then finally, another new piece of information we just learned today was that PHMSA investigated an allegation of coding inspection reports of falsifying coding inspection reports once again, but this time relating to the thickness of the pipeline's coating. But they didn't find evidence to substantiate that. And if you can click forward one thing, Kelly, thanks. So we're really grateful for this information, for PHMSA for finally responding to us, and also for being here tonight on this call. But to be honest, this letter left us with a lot of more concerns and questions. So first off, PHMSA didn't agree to any of our demands, such as halting operation while investigations are ongoing. Again, we know the Attorney General is investigating in Pennsylvania. It appears that they're relying maybe on self-reported data, which is concerning. And also Shell has completed inline inspections and surveys. Again, we are asking for independent integrity assessment of the pipeline because we can't trust Shell's reporting. So we're grateful for this information, but sadly still have a lot of concerns and a lot of questions. Next slide. This is what most of our requests for information look like so far on the Falcon. There's a lot we don't know. Very little has been made public. Many of our public records requests have come back really redacted, but we do have evidence that federal and state agencies have been looking into issues with the Falcon for almost 2 years. The whistleblower accusations have been thoroughly vetted and reported to public officials at some of the highest ranking offices in our federal government. And despite all of these investigations ongoing, including accusations of workers being retaliated against, construction was allowed to continue and is nearly complete. There are, anyone in this region knows there's a lot of pipelines. Many of them are risky. Many of them have been investigated, but what we're seeing with the Falcon is highly unusual and it's really concerning. It's not common to see Pennsylvania DEP take this kind of action. Again, basically calling out, the agency that's above them for failing to address whistleblowers. Okay, next slide. And in addition to all of these concerns that are being investigated that we don't have answers to, there are many issues that we do clearly know happened. Again, where pipelines are bored beneath kind of a sensitive area, those horizontal directional drills, there's a drilling fluid used, and Shell has spilled over 250,000 gallons of this in the 3 states the pipeline crosses, but some estimates are as high as 3 million gallons of this industrial waste. We really don't know the full extent because they could be failing to report these. And this poses a threat to drinking water wells and surface water along the route. Okay, next slide. So Shell's water supply monitoring plan states that In the event that a water supply is affected by project activities, Shell Pipeline Company LC will restore or replace the water supply to be reliable as the affected water supply, be as permanent as the affected water supply, and deliver the amount of water necessary. So that is their obligation. Unfortunately, we've learned of a few people in Ohio and Pennsylvania whose well water has been impacted, and we would recommend contacting your public agency right away, because Shell is required to be self-reporting these incidents, but there's no way for the public to know if they're actually doing that. So definitely file a complaint and request your complaint ID number. And if you have any issues with that, let us know. And I think we'll put a link to the chat so you can actually click on these links. Also, if you notice any impacts to your land, we've heard of some perhaps flooding and runoff happening with this pipeline. Take a lot of photos and document what you see happening. Okay, last slide. Finally, I just wanted to add there are over 8,700 people living within 1.25 miles of the Falcon, which is shown in yellow here. There are 5 schools, 6 daycares, and 16 emergency response letters. In red are some places here where Shell marked that the pipeline directly impacts a sensitive area, like a populated neighborhood or a groundwater drinking water system. So there's a lot at stake, and the public deserves answers. I wanted to ask if Tucker was able to join our call. Tucker Harris is an Ohio landowner who's been impacted by the Falcon pipeline. He's joining us from phone. So there may be some like unmuting that has to happen. I just asked someone to unmute with a T. Maybe that's him. Tucker, is that you?
Yeah, I'm here now.
Okay, cool. Do you mind talking a little bit about your experience and how the Falcon impacted your property?
I have lived on my present property here for 29 years. We are sandy shale material. We built a house, so we actually built it. We didn't contract it. I work in the construction industry and have for 30 years. I know when we drilled the well, we are sandy shale clear to the bottom, 125 foot deep. We've got artesian springs on the property. When they ran the Falcon past us, it's within 1,000 feet of my house. We know they had a blowout. Like I said, I work in the industry. My wife works in the industry, and so does my son. He works pipeline, and he works in the environmental crew. That job, that part of the Falcon, he was not employed on. It was a directional bore, as she had said earlier, a horizontal bore. It was a wetlands, and they had to come underneath the wetlands. Literally, it was within 1,000 foot of my house. Whenever they look for the end of it, because there's a void or something, they'll lose the end. They can't find it with their guns, locators. It blew out the end. Now, shortly thereafter, when we knew this was going on, I started getting a gray sludge in my well water. I have water filters. We do have a well. And we noticed that. And I've actually saved my water filters. And you pull the filters, it's like a gray slime, which is what they actually use on the directional bores. I do know this. We've never had that We've never had that problem. There's actually a well on the adjacent farm next to mine. I worked whenever they did the frack, and I'm quite familiar with, the industry. If you're pumping 1,000 barrel a minute at 10,000 psi, or 100 barrel a minute at 10,000 psi, and we never had any issues with our well water. There's never been any problems at all until after they did the directional bore. So without a doubt, and that this was the culprit of what had happened, and it is that gray slime. Again, I've worked in the industry. I was actually at the Shell plant. I worked in the Shell refinery. I worked in all the Mark West plants over the years since the gas and oil industry. My entire family has worked in this industry for 10 plus years. We've made a living off of it. and we know that it can be done safely. However, you know, when they do have this, again, I also work in the industry and I'm very familiar with how the contractors and how the owners, being Shell or whoever, try to minimize, because of EPA regulations and whatnot, the effects of what it's done to the landowners. Myself personally, it can be done right, but now I've got a well that is absolutely affected. Again, you don't get gray sludge out of sandy shale material, and we've lived here for 28 years. So it's a very bad situation, and a lot of it's been hidden, and it's infuriating, to be quite honest, that we had no intention. We live in the country, and they come in and they just be honest about the situation, you know, make it right. There was actually one of the boys, or one of the gentlemen that was actually on that was part of that crew, actually currently works for me. Didn't know that until about 6 weeks ago, and we just happened to talk, and he's like, well, I was on that part, I was on that section. And he actually explained to me some of what had happened and transpired, and how bad that spill, or how bad, you know, the mislocation when they lost the end of the bore. It come from what I understand from him and from others, you know, including my son. When it goes, in the end, it finds a pocket, you know, that's fracked. Of course, again, the well, there is a vertical in the Marcella Utica. There's 2 wells, gas and oil wells, so the ground has been fracked. There was 46 stages in those 2 wells. So the ground has been shot anyway, so it fracks to get the gas, to receive the gas and oil out of the ground. Well, now we come through, and we have a loss at the end. Well, all the sludge that just goes out in the open, and where's it go? It leaches out, and now we've got issues with our well.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Next up is Terry Baumgartner. Terry is an Aliquippa resident and a local leader who's been working to shed light on the health impacts of the petrochemical development over the past several years. She's the outreach coordinator with the Clean Air Council. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you to Sister Carrie and Erica and Tucker. People everywhere want uncontaminated drinking water, but I wonder how many of those 30,000 residents in 9 communities near me who get their drinking water from the pristine, high-quality Ambridge Reservoir know this, that the Falcon pipeline crosses the reservoir's headwaters. How many of them know that the Falcon also crosses the raw water line from the reservoir to their drinking water supply? In my hometown of Aliquippa, we get our drinking water, as do 5 million other people, from the Ohio River. But the Falcon crosses the Ohio too. And that crossing from Saline Township, Ohio, into Grant District, West Virginia, is just upstream from drinking water intakes for the cities of Toronto and Steubenville, Ohio, and Weirton, West Virginia. Similar risks are faced by the residents of CO and Cadiz in Ohio, where the Falcon crosses the Tappan Lake Reservoir that supplies their drinking water. Next slide. Besides endangering our water, the Falcon is, like all pipelines, too prone to leak, rupture, and explode. Next slide. The 2018 Revolution pipeline explosion 2.5 miles from my home was likely caused by a landslide, with one family narrowly escaping the crack of dawn fire that destroyed their home, a barn, several cars, and prompted the evacuation of 25 to 30 other families. The potential for explosions is an unsettling parallel between Shell's Falcon and Sunoco's Mariner East pipeline, which stretches across our entire state. Next slide. For starters, both the Falcon and the Mariner carry volatile, hazardous natural gas liquids that as Erica told us, are heavier than air. So a leak becomes a nearly undetectable but flammable vapor cloud that not only can asphyxiate, hard to pronounce, those unable to escape, but it can also be ignited by a car ignition, a cell phone, or a doorbell. In April, in response to a case brought by Chester and Delaware County residents, a judge for Pennsylvania's Public Utility Commission found Sunoco had violated state and federal regulations in failing to properly disclose all the risks posed by a potential leak or rupture of the Mariner. Nowhere on its pamphlets or mailers did Sunoco tell residents and responders that those risks include property damage, personal injury, asphyxiation, burns, death, or fatality. The judge also said Sunoco was intentional and negligent in refusing to meet with local emergency officials who needed more information, and in providing for proper training of first responders or proper alerting of the public to the event in the event of an accident. Instead, Sunoco used Homeland Security to justify withholding its emergency plans from the public, the police, and school leaders. Moreover, this $33.8 billion company created no plan for evacuating the most vulnerable among us, the elderly, the young, the sick, the disabled, from a pipeline accident site where cars and cell phones cannot be used. To Sunoco's protests that providing emergency protections is not its wheelhouse, the judge declared, with the right to do business in Pennsylvania comes responsibility. We need to find out whether Shell has assumed its full responsibility for emergency provisions like those that Sunoco sidestepped. It is now common knowledge that the Mariner's construction resulted in hundreds of violations, including frequent inadvertent returns, that's the industry's euphemism for spills, and sinkholes. Anyone who's researched Shell's 194 pipeline incidents in the 17 years preceding the Falcon might have predicted its release of that 250,000 gallons of industrial waste in more than 70 violation accidents. Why can't we rely on Shell to protect us from pipeline spills and accidents? In 2016, the world's fourth richest corporation at the time could have afforded and simply provided fence line monitoring of emissions, as well as flare limits at its cracker plant in Beaver County. It could have won trust for its claim of being Beaver County's good neighbor, but instead Shell argued that fence line monitoring was unnecessary, and so forced two nonprofits, Clean Air Council and Environmental Integrity Project, to fight a costly 2-year legal battle for these protections. Next slide. From Shell's handling of its subsequent so-called community meetings here to its deliberate suppression of what it knew about climate change in the early 1990s, this corporation has not been a model of transparency or accountability. What about our government? Can we trust it to protect us? The Trump administration rolled back more than 100 environmental rules, including those governing air, water, and toxic chemicals. In Pennsylvania, the absence of any centralized blueprint for dealing with a pipeline accident is an irresponsible void that leaves most residents at the mercy of a patchwork of local emergency plans. Consider also the absence of any statewide science-based setbacks for pipelines. A void Clean Air Council and partners are trying to fill with a new protective buffers campaign designed to spur our legislators to mandate such long overdue setbacks. And Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection lost the trust of many when it sued Grant Township in 2017 because the township's citizen-supported home rule charter banned an injection well for toxic and radioactive fracking waste. 75 to 85% of the testimonies at 3 citizen-requested public hearings in 2018 passionately opposed the Falcon pipeline. But even if it seems that those testimonies went unheard, we as citizens must continue to point out government and corporate obligations to provide for our safety and meet basic standards. because we have no other choice. Until our state and federal agencies return fully to their mission statements, it's left to us, the people, to fight for our rights to pure water, clean air, and our families' health and safety. Thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over now to Ellen.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for the invitation to speak at this public meeting. Most of my immediate and extended family members still reside in Beaver County, and many of them live within the 5-mile evacuation zone of the Shell cracker plant. I also have the misfortune of having the Mariner East 2 and 2X pipelines running through my property in Huntington County, Pennsylvania. Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution states, "The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. Whether it's fracking, pipelines, cracker plants, or shipping terminals, petrochemical companies have run roughshod over the rights guaranteed to Pennsylvania citizens in the Constitution. People in Dimmock and the Woodlands have been without clean drinking water for over a decade. Abandoned and orphaned wells leach into the soil and water. Cancer clusters attributed to fracking have occurred in southwestern Pennsylvania. Eastern PA has had multiple inadvertent returns and sinkholes from pipeline construction. Our own personal fight with Sunoco/ETP has been going on for over 6 years now. I'm just going to run through a very quick timeline because what's happened with us on our property is not a unique story. It's something that's happened almost anywhere any of these pipelines, fracking wells, cracker plants have popped up. It began in 2015 when a land agent first approached us with a plan for the Mariner East easement. This easement impacted wetlands, forests, and a pond on our property. We refused, and by August found ourselves in eminent domain proceedings. In 2016, Sunoco was granted eminent domain, which gave them the right to begin cutting down trees, which they could do without any permits. And that surprised me. They did not need any of the permits from DEP in order to begin clearing the land. Sunoco was also granted an injunction, which barred us from entering the easement. 3 people were arrested as a result of a small protest we had on our property. They were arrested for summary disorderly conduct and summary trespass, which are both rather minor offenses. One had a bail set at $200,000 and another had a bail set at $100,000. Ultimately, the case was dropped. The charges were dropped. In 2017, DEP issued water crossing and erosion permits. We began a series of tree sits in order to slow down construction because we did have some court cases ongoing. Sunoco violated the Migratory Bird Act by continuing to cut trees, but of course they were not fined for this. In 2018, I was arrested for entering the easement on my own property in violation of the injunction, and I was sentenced to 2 to 7 months in the Center County Correctional Facility. By 2019, construction was essentially finished, although we still have 3 court cases that are currently ongoing. One would think that agencies such as the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and PHMSA would have the best interests of the environment and safety and health of Pennsylvania citizens in mind. Unfortunately, these 2 agencies are far more likely to be reactive to violations rather than proactive. We complained to DEP about Sunoco's lack of assessment of the geology, geography, and hydrology of the Mariner East easement. We also pointed out that Sunoco misclassified our wetlands. claiming they were not forested, despite the fact that they cut down over 150 trees. DEP never bothered to check this out until after we filed our lawsuit. After our lawsuit was filed, that was the first time DEP showed up to assess the property. The Environmental Hearing Board agreed with us and ruled that the DEP failed to verify the information that Sunoco had supplied on their permit application. How much other misinformation has slipped through the cracks? That's the question. The citizens of Pennsylvania are essentially on their own, and the deck is stacked against them. Fighting against these corporations takes a toll physically, mentally, emotionally, and financially. We've been brought up to think that, you can't win against these corporations. They're just too big and their pockets are too deep. These corporations are like playground bullies who know that they can get away with violations with little more than a slap on the wrist. This is why it's important for us, the people, to forge strong alliances with one another. Fracking, pipelines, and refineries depend on each other. We need to do the same. Resistance along any point can be effective. We need to support one another any way we can. We are stronger together when we share information and resources with each other. We have to continue to bear witness and make our voices heard, even when our government chooses to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear. With that in mind, I want to thank you for this opportunity. And I would now like to turn the discussion over to Bob Schmetzler. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Hello and welcome from Beaver County, Marcellus Awareness Community. Our county has experienced one of the worst gas and hazardous liquid pipeline explosions in our history. The Sunoco Revolution pipeline, the one that blew up here in Center Township. Many investigations by the numerous agencies, Pennsylvania DEP, the Public Utility Commission, local and state agencies, were trying to find out what happened. Permits were applied for and permitted. Engineers squeezed off with their professional seals. Citizens relied on the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to be responsible for regulating and ensuring the safe and secure movement of hazardous materials through pipelines. Their Office of Pipeline Safety ensures safety in the design, construction, operation, maintenance, and spill response planning of America's natural gas and hazardous liquid transportation pipelines. We received a copy of the Federal Register from May 2nd of 2019, covering pipeline safety and potential damage to pipeline facilities caused by earth movement and other geological hazards. The terrain in Beaver County has steep hills, rivers, streams, railroad centers, major highways, high voltage electric towers, and many homes and businesses that are affected by these pipelines. The Sunoco Revolution pipelines slipped at the bottom of the hill and support soil caved into Raccoon Creek. Pennsylvania DEP wrote them up with a fine and a 5-year of future inspections. Before the week was up, the weld pulled apart at the top of the hill due to excess weight pulling on it by the tonnage of steel pipe. It looked like about a 10-foot part from looking at the pictures. Now today, you have to go back and support that weight. Falcon pipeline also goes through this same steep terrain with earth movement caused by rain, springs, underground coal vein fires, caves by mining, caving in, and pipes under the Ohio River where dredging occurs, makes us wonder if government that we pay for and rely on is doing their due diligence. We're asking them to be proactive and don't rely on being reactive. Our common interest is the worker and the public safety. Thank you very much, and I'll introduce Adam Arnold.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the organizers and to Erica at Frac Tracker for inviting me to this meeting. I'm Adam Arnold. I'm an environmental counsel for Government Accountability Project. We're a nonprofit whistleblower protection organization based in Washington, D.C. And it's great to have a chance to speak with this community. I'm going to start by repeating what we all know. Pipelines leak, and pipelines carrying hazardous materials need to be especially well made, monitored, and maintained. I could give examples, but I think we've heard so many examples of incidents that have occurred because of the nature of pipelines, and in part because whistleblowers are either not heard or do not come forward. And that's what we do, is we help whistleblowers come forward with this information. If you can just hold on that slide while I move ahead. So I'm just going to start by saying, if you want to make a disclosure, or if you've already made a disclosure, or if you've already faced retaliation for making a disclosure, you should find and speak to a lawyer who is familiar with whistleblower law. I'm not here to advertise for Government Accountability Project. We're online at whistleblower.org. But I'm here to say that we are one among many organizations and law firms that can offer the legal advice necessary to navigate the demanding and complicated process of blowing the whistle. And as a nonprofit, our services are generally pro bono. So moving on to this current slide, we're not just a law firm. We do defend whistleblower clients, but we also know that this is not always enough to address the issues whistleblowers raise. So we also work on media campaigns, and we work on writing and improving the laws that protect the public by protecting whistleblowers. We work with partners and with coalitions, including other organizations that work with whistleblowers, as well as with allies on specific topics like Frac Tracker. We also conduct investigations, we work with Congress and take part in congressional hearings. And we do public outreach and education on the importance and rights of whistleblowers, like I'm doing right now. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. A little history of our organization. These are just a few of the examples of work that we've done on environmental issues. We've worked with government scientists who have exposed alteration of scientific research and data to fuel the denial of anthropomorphic climate change, and with climate scientists who have faced retaliation for doing their job when the federal government didn't want them to. We've worked for over 11 years on the fallout from the Deepwater Horizon disaster, publishing 3 reports based on the testimony of dozens of witnesses that the chemical dispersants used to supposedly clean up the spill actually hid the oil from view, while making it far more toxic to people and the environment. And over the years, we've worked with numerous whistleblowers within the nuclear energy sector. We helped to shut down or delay construction on a number of nuclear facilities that were not meeting safety standards. Even if we never will know for certain, we think we've helped to prevent major nuclear accidents by helping those whistleblowers expose the threats that they identified. So pipelines leak, and they can also explode. Maybe it's not as bad as a reactor meltdown, but bad enough if you're in the blast zone. The pipeline, petroleum, and plastics industries all pose threats to the public, while downplaying the harm that their products or activities actually cause. The public should be informed of these threats and should have a voice in deciding how, when, and whether projects are approved and developed. Next slide, please. So what is a whistleblower? There's a pretty, I think I might have to click on something to get, there we go. There's a pretty good legal definition here. A whistleblower is usually an employee, because employees usually have the best inside track on when their employer may be doing something they shouldn't. But many environmental statutes, like the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, empower private citizens to blow the whistle if they come across, say, a factory dumping waste into the river, or a pipeline leaking oil on their property. The disclosure is the key. What important information is the whistleblower sharing? In addition to what's listed here, sharing information about fraud or a violation of scientific integrity, like altering or burying valid research, may also constitute a disclosure. And there are other variations that justify the caveat, talk to a lawyer. Next slide, please. I think the slides are moving a little slowly here. I'm not sure how we can speed that along. Yeah, note that there only needs to be a reasonable belief. If it turns out that the thing that a whistleblower is disclosing is just a false alarm, as long as there is something the average person could reasonably suspect might be a problem, the whistleblower has legal protection. So that shouldn't deter people from coming forward if they aren't positive that they can't, that they can prove there's something terrible going on. Now, if anyone knows that you can't stand your boss, that might hurt your credibility, but it does not mean you don't have a valid complaint. There's another talk to a lawyer point, and that is the question of to whom a disclosure may be made. Some laws can require that the disclosure be made to a particular office, such as through an agency inspector general. Well, going through the chain of command can work if you think others in that chain will be on your side, but you can make your disclosure elsewhere if that seems like the best route. Most importantly, your rights kick in as soon as you speak up. So once others know of your concerns, any action taken against you may be shown to be retaliatory. Next slide, please. Retaliation can take many forms, and we refer to them as prohibited personnel practices. The only limit on how an employer can retaliate against a whistleblowing employee is the limit of the employer's imagination. So this is not an exhaustive list, but in essence, if an employer takes action against an employee who has made a disclosure, it can be considered retaliation. Ideally, any adverse action once an employee has blown the whistle should demand accountability, but in reality, laws and courts often allow justification that ignores the retaliatory intent. So beware, sometimes these things don't hold up like they're supposed to. If you're fired after blowing the whistle, your boss could point to that one day that you came in late as justification for firing you. And some laws and courts will say that's good enough. So that's why blowing the whistle can be perilous, and it's why we're here to provide protection. And it's also why if this presentation were a song, the chorus would be "Talk to a Lawyer." Next slide, please. There are over 50 federal whistleblower protection laws and numerous state laws. And this patchwork means that it can be unclear what whistleblower has what rights. Creating a unified gold standard approach so that any whistleblower will be afforded the best legal protection is one of our organization's goals, but the current system of laws has developed largely piecemeal over decades and may therefore not surprisingly be rather confusing. There are various laws to protect government employees and contractors, mostly focusing on preventing retaliation or compensating those who experience it. There's the False Claims Act, which is available to anybody for reporting fraud against the government. If a company is receiving federal funding for, say, worker safety training, and the CEO is using that money to buy a yacht, you can bring that claim under the False Claims Act. And if the government takes and wins the case, you can actually get a percentage of what they regain as a bounty. Next slide, please. Here are some laws that might be more applicable to members of this community who might have a disclosure to share or may have already made a disclosure and face retaliation. Well, different laws may apply to your situation. There's no guarantee that any of them will provide the necessary protection or will help make you whole if you have faced retaliation. Some require that you report any retaliation within 30 days of its occurrence, or you lose your ability to make that claim. Others make it impossible to get in front of a jury, so you're stuck in front of an administrative judge, where whistleblowers rarely prevail. But it's important to be able to identify your rights, and determining which law or laws apply to your situation is an important step. I'm going to emphasize the Pipeline Safety Improvement Act to say that it's not a great law. We're currently working with Congress to improve it. There have hardly been any cases outside of administrative courts, which means we don't know how effective it is, but the guess is not very. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be used if it applies, but only that we have little to go on regarding its effectiveness, and we know areas where it can be improved. So just beware if you need to go that route. And again, in any given instance, there may be applicable state laws, and that's just one more reason it's good to talk to an eligible lawyer, because there's so many laws out there. You really need to find someone who's aware and familiar with all of them that may apply. We actually do refer to state lawyers as well, with whom we work, who have the intimate knowledge of some of these state laws. Next slide, please. The last several slides are just going to be a quick overview and review of best practices for blowing the whistle successfully. So next slide. Okay, the first one, again, goes without saying at this point. Number 2, keep records, write things down and save them. The time and date you notice something, the time and date you tell someone about it, any emails or other documents mentioning the issue, and anything you can save. You can't have too much information as long as it's information that you're allowed to have. Avoid accessing files that are restricted to you. Avoid taking files or hard copies that are not yours to take. Basically, avoid doing things that may count against you. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of going through these so-called proper channels, well, use them if they're available and if they seem safe. The downside is you might be inviting a retaliation without realizing it, but the upside is that you'll be creating a record and establishing that the company knows you're bringing attention to the problem. Then later, if the company retaliates, they'll have a much harder time claiming that any actions taken against you were not in response to your disclosure. And plus, they might even address the problem you're raising. Who knows? It could happen. Next slide, please. Maintaining anonymity, that may help to avoid retaliation, but it's usually very difficult to do. And again, it's not entirely advantageous. In many circumstances, the company will be able to figure out who you are anyway, since only so many people would know what you know. So again, there may be a bigger advantage to being on the record with your complaint. If anonymity is important to you, think very carefully about whether it is a realistic goal, and think about blowing the whistle and whether it's a good idea, which of course you should do in any event, because it is a very hazardous thing to do. If possible, before making a disclosure, you should try to gauge the position of your coworkers and of your friends and family. These are the people whose support you will need, as blowing the whistle can have tremendous impacts not only on your work life, but on your home life as well. Blowing the whistle can be incredibly stressful if you don't have allies, and even if you do sometimes. I mean, I'm encouraged that this community is coming together for this meeting. It gives me hope that there is support for anyone here who might want to make a disclosure about any problems they encounter. It's very encouraging. Next slide, please. Just about done here. In fact, I've really only scratched the surface. There is a lot of information to know, and I recommend finding out more. Look wherever you can, including on our website, where we have a lot of information, including various guides for whistleblowers and for working with whistleblowers. And I'll just conclude by saying it's been a pleasure to speak with everyone here. Thank you again for inviting me. Thank you to all the other speakers. I look forward to engaging with you further on the important issues being raised here. And I'll just conclude by saying one of the most important things for a whistleblower is to not feel alone and isolated, which is what the companies like to do to the squeaky wheels. So knowing that they're supported by the public is very important. And I think this community is really well positioned to stand up to power and to help make sure that the public well-being is a top consideration when decisions that affect the community are made. Thank you again, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A or contact me by email, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to all of our speakers. Before we move on to questions, I'd like to pass it over to Heaven Sensky, a community organizer with the Center for Coalfield Justice. And she's going to discuss how we're going to take everything that's been shared tonight and channel it into action. Heaven is a community organizer with the Center for Coalfield Justice who serves in Washington and Greene counties in southwestern Pennsylvania. She leads the work on mitigating and investigating the prevalence of childhood cancers in those communities and organizes around the impacts of oil and gas development. She resides on a small family farm in 84, Pennsylvania, where she's been an active community member and advocacy and nonprofit work for over a decade. Welcome, Heaven. I keep wanting to call you Helen. Welcome, Heaven.
Thank you. So obviously there are a lot of issues being addressed today with Shell and the construction of the Falcon pipeline. And as residents, we need to be protected. We deserve to know that our government at all levels is working to keep us safe after they permitted this pipeline to come into our region. We need to know that Shell's money and political influence won't let them off the hook if they did something that puts us all in jeopardy. We need to know that the information they're submitting is independently verified. We need to know that the operation of the pipeline is consistent with new rules and regulations that we're learning from past disasters, as we've heard about from the Mariner East pipeline. We need to know that when people speak up and speak out, that they won't face retaliation for doing what's right. So to start to get all of these things, we're asking PHMSA to hold their own town hall where they provide information about the ongoing investigation against Shell, where they answer the concerns raised here today, and where they commit to taking action against Shell to make sure that we're safe. We can come together to support one another, but we alone can't make Shell do the right thing. PHMSA can, and we need to know that they will. So we're going to drop a petition in the chat right now, and we're encouraging you all to sign this petition asking PHMSA to hold their own town hall for residents where they will be held accountable to our questions and where they will have to bring information about all of these things. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sister Carrie for the Q&A.
Thank you. So we're going to leave the remainder of our meeting tonight free to ask questions and maybe hopefully get answers. And for anyone to share their experiences or concerns with the Falcon pipeline. We also have Melissa Marshall joining us to help answer questions. Melissa is the community advocate with Mountain Watershed Association, where she empowers communities about legal tools and processes that protect them from the impacts of natural gas and coal extraction. Welcome, Melissa.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah. As I mentioned, it's good to see you again. As I mentioned earlier, we also have public officials joining us tonight from PHMSA and PADEP. As Heaven said, People Over Petro is asking PHMSA to listen to these concerns and questions and hold a public hearing to address the points raised tonight and explain exactly where they are in their investigation and what they're doing to address these concerns. In addition to asking questions, if you've been impacted by Falcon construction, please feel free to write that in the chat and share that experience as well. If you're joining us by phone, we're going to take a moment, and I think tech support is going to unmute you, and you can say your name and we'll add you to the list for questions. Are they unmuted? They're not unmuted. I think the folks on the phone are still muted. Okay, we'll come back. So one of the first questions in the chat was, this could be either for Erica or Melissa and or Ellen. I'm not sure who would be the best one to take this. Is there a reason why operators and permittees are allowed to submit their own data without verification? Is it purely budgetary, or is the system really set up to assume that companies will honestly report their failings?
Yeah, I think you sort of got it there. My guess would be that it's mostly budgetary. I will say also that it's really common to find across extractive industries. For example, with mining, we also assume that mining operators will report when citizens call them with complaints of water supply contamination or subsidence property damage. So it's just, you know, it could just be, it's sort of like historically built into this industry that we're assuming that they're going to tell the truth. But I will also say that, you know, I've heard at least like Pennsylvania DEP staff say that they really have a preference that residents work out these complaints with the operators as much as possible before they even contact DEP, which I sort of read as being, you know, sort of guarding DEP resources in that way. So they'd really prefer not to expend any state agency resources on these issues, and ideally just have the operator do the inspection and then supply people with water supply replacements or do whatever that needs to be done without even really ever barely involving the state agency at all. And the issue there, like Erica mentioned, is that then there's no public record. You know, there's no way to know if these complaints are being logged properly, if they are reporting within 24 hours like they're supposed to. You know, there's no way to know about timing. If people are just contacting the operator and not immediately contacting the state agencies as well. And when people do contact the state agency, that builds a public record that organizations like ours can then request and develop information and databases about how many people are being impacted by these pipelines. So it's really important to report to the agencies immediately as well.
Thank you. A question for Adam. What is the legal standard for proving that a firing has been retaliatory against a whistleblower? Is it difficult to prove that?
It varies. This is one of the problems with whistleblower laws, is there's so many different ones, but there's a range of standards, anything from a really strict but-for, which means you have to prove that the only reason they fired you was because of your whistleblowing, which is a hard standard to meet. Most of the environmental statutes have a motivating factor, which is a little less strict, but still kind of puts the onus on the whistleblower. One of the good things about the Pipeline Safety and Improvement Act is that it does feature a contributing standard, which basically just means you have to show that one of the reasons they did something to you was because of your disclosures. It can be a difficult standard to meet, and of course the goal is to shift the burden onto the employer to prove that it wasn't your disclosure that caused them to retaliate against you. And again, the problem is that depending on the law and the court, you may you may or may not have a challenge to meet that standard. So yes, this is one of the difficulties is meeting that burden.
Thank you. So a term I've heard a couple of times tonight, things like a blast zone or explosion zone. Is there currently like a setback, or are there protective buffers in place, and what would be safe protective buffers? And I'm not sure which panelist would be best to answer that. Maybe Terry or Erica, maybe Bob. I'm not sure who would want to field that question.
It's pretty much up to municipalities to enact protective zoning ordinances. There is this limited 500-foot setback, but what happens with that is there are so many exceptions. I heard a report this morning, I think on Allegheny Front, or maybe it was something like Allegheny Front, that because of all the exceptions, it's a pretty ineffective thing, even what setback there is. The Protective Buffers campaign that Clean Air Council has launched is based on the research of their attorneys and engineers into the distances needed for some level of safety from all the components of fracking infrastructure. Pipelines certainly, but also wells and compressor stations and all of the other things that go with the petrochemical build out. So that's, we don't have a centralized statewide blueprint for really protective setbacks that might actually make a difference. And that applies to homes and schools and hospitals and all sorts of places of worship, all sorts of vulnerable gatherings of people. It's something we really need.
Thank you. Ellen, you had mentioned issues with companies requiring people to sign non-disclosure agreements. Would you be willing to comment more on that?
Yeah, there are, particularly with when people have had wells impacted, Sunoco will offer to provide water buffaloes, to provide potable water for the family, but in order to get that, they generally have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which basically says, you know, I can't talk about it. I can't tell you what any of the terms of the agreement are. You know, I can't say that it's, you know, that my loss of, say, drinking water was the result of, you know, construction of the well, you know, 500 feet from my house. It's a real problem because you're caught between a rock and a hard place. You know, if you don't have any water or you need something, but in order to get that, you have to promise that you're not going to talk about it. You know, it can be a difficult decision sometimes for people.
I imagine. There is a question, and I'm not sure who this would be best for, maybe Erica. When do you think we will hear back from PHMSA? And I think this is in reference to the petition that's being signed.
Yeah, so we're going to ask that within 30 days that we send it off to PHMSA, that they respond as to whether or not they're going to be holding this meeting. So once we collect our, you know, we'll probably have it open for maybe 2 weeks to get a lot of signatures, and then we'll send it off. We designed this before we knew, of course, PHMSA PHMSA would be on the call today. So if they're able to respond to this request, that would be great. But if not, hopefully within 30 days as to whether or not they'll hold this meeting to address all of our concerns. So if you have something specific that you're concerned about in your neck of the woods, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll record that and keep that record, so that we can, communicate to PHMSA what people's concerns are.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat box, and I'm not sure who best to direct this to. During construction, there have been many transportation PennDOT violations, access permits, bridge class violations, dawn to dusk allowable hour infractions, overweight trucks, damage to roads, signs, and other property. Is there a way to take action on these, or at least to support or include this in any other action? We have some documentation and testimonies of instances of citizens being offered money to not report violations and what is considered bullying.
Can I ask a question on that one? Can in the chat, Tara? Can you perhaps give a little bit more information about where you're located, what county you're located in?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
I'm work with BC MAC and Allegheny Land Trust and the Three Rivers Permaculture Guild. And this information has been gathered from, I have an informant in PennDOT Bridge. He evaluates all the bridges, and also in conversations with people in the area who just contractors, just as coming up, contractors that have said that they, contractors that have worked for me that live near the pipeline and where the trucks have been going 24 hours in the school, next to school roads and with no other access. So this was brought up several times at BC MAC, but we never did anything with it. So that's the background on this.
I'll drop an email address in the chat box, and we can talk about it and bring it up with some other members of People Over Petro Coalition to see how we can help support that, because that all sounds like it's really awful to live next to that kind of activity. So I'll drop an email address in the chat. Okay.
Okay, I'm from Edgeworth, so my standing is from the water reservoir, the water access.
Thank you. There's a question for Tucker in the chat as well. How was Shell as an employer, and do you have any concerns based on your experience working for Shell? If you're able to answer that question.
Working with Shell was not, we were a subcontractor. We were not directly working for Shell. The contractors, two lead contractors on that were Bechtel and McCarles. So we were actually subbed into them. I was on that project various times. But at that point, you also have to realize there's 10,000 construction workers on that site. So you start asking some questions, you're just one of 10,000. I never had any issues with them or anybody related on that side. The only, like I said, on a project that size, there's just, anonymity is pretty easy to maintain. I didn't have any issues, and I don't, mind, stating anything. I mean, to me, this is my home. We've lived here a long time. My water's pretty important.
Thank you. There's actually another comment in the chat box, and I'm not quite sure I understand it, and so I'm going to try to read it to you. It says, can you comment on how a person who stands up for and in defense of water, and when one tries to when one tries to warn the employees, they themselves become enemy number one to the point where entire families are put in danger. Anyone bringing up problems, the entire world is told you want to take jobs and food from families. And then they say, this is simply for caring. So I'm not sure if you're able to comment on that or not.
I'm not really sure how to take that. I mean, we work in the industry, and my wife as well. Like I said, I mean, most of us, we do work in the industry. But our families are first and foremost. We do what we do, you know. I mean, it's a living. It's a way to make, you know, a good living. And if the projects run appropriately, it's not a problem. There can be, on the upper management side, I would say it could get pretty hairy. But like I said, we were a subcontractor, so we didn't deal with Shell directly that much. But I was on that project several times.
Thank you. And there's a question, I'm not sure which panelist would be best to answer this question. Is there some kind of packet of data or a report that could be sent to educate others? I'm asking because I'm pretty sure the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District does not have a clue about this, and the Falcon cuts through the Tappan Lake watershed, which also supplies water to Cadiz, Ohio. The MWCD is building a $10 million marina on the lake, and if this affects the lake, well, they're going to lose their money. I live here as well and would be willing to send info as well as contact them via phone and email. That's a great question. Erica, are you able to take that?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. So I put in the chat a link to our public environmental impact assessment. There's a ton there, but unfortunately, when the Falcon was being permitted, the issues around the Tappan Lake Reservoir didn't receive, I don't think, enough attention really as they should have. The Falcon crosses below the water line, and in Pennsylvania, there was a ton of residents that spoke up about this and were able to get the Falcon depth lowered a little bit below the water line, which was due to some great organizing of people on the call. And I don't think that happened in Cadiz, Ohio. So I think we should probably just meet up and maybe talk about specific things to that reservoir. I didn't know this information about the marina, so we should definitely have maybe a separate call to talk specifically about that site, because it could be, pretty impactful if there were issues there. And the other thing is, it doesn't seem like the Falcon is being investigated by the Ohio EPA. They really haven't been responsive to our letters, and it doesn't look like PHMSA is working with them. That's a question that I would direct towards PHMSA during the public hearing. How are you working with Ohio and West Virginia? Seems like those states are kind of maybe getting a little bit left behind. And so thanks for raising that point.
Thank you. And then I think we've got time for maybe one more question. And again, I'm not sure who would be best to answer this. Maybe Terry? Maybe Bob too. Is the community being educated yet about transitioning jobs to the green renewable industry, which is quickly growing internationally? I know there's a Reimagine Appalachia, and I'm not sure who on this call is part of that.
Well,
Stoner?
yeah. You want to take it or me?
No, you go ahead. No.
Well, you can chime in, but Joanne Martin is the leader of Reimagine Beaver County, And we had in 2017, 3 programs for Beaver County citizens to come together and brainstorm ideas for a green economy. And there were a wonderful series of meetings, and then a report based on those meetings was produced, and it's quite good. We've had then in May of 2019 a solar festival that was supposed to introduce the report to our county leaders, but they have not been receptive. And so we are, you know, with Reimagine Beaver County, they are pretty much branching out, working on their own with Reimagine Appalachia, which is a tri-state, 4 states working together for the same kind of objective, bring green jobs here. And that connection has been very good. I think it'll be very fruitful. Trying to think of a couple of projects that are underway, being talked about, that I think will be significant. And Reimagine Beaver County has a Facebook page. If you're looking to start investigating this, that would be a good place to start. Bob, what have I left out?
Well, we were talking about alternatives to petrochemicals. I think that's a big deal. We've seen a couple places open up, one in Ambridge, one in Leedsdale, dealing with environmental issues of hemp. They're doing stuff with hemp. I think they're extracting the oil, and the others making newspapers into some kind of potting soil. And they've been around for a couple years now, but we're looking for an industrial park to have green industries move in Beaver County and start to gather the attention of all the political people on creating clean jobs. And plastic doesn't need to be made from petrochemicals. And you look at the first diesel vehicle, it ran on vegetable oil. It did not run on petrochemical power. So there's a lot out there that's coming. When the cracker plant goes into operation, there's going to be an exodus of people out of this area. They're all going to, people are going to be looking for jobs because they're not going to have that many here. Right now, you have at least 8,000 workers constructing the plant. They're only going to have a few hundred running it, and some of them will be doing it electronically from Texas. So it'll be like when the steel industry pulled out. We're going to have a lot of vacant homes. So people are going to be looking for jobs, and I think the green new industries are going to be able to grasp their attention and get some really good public support and some financial support. Reinvent Beaver County is tied in with Reinvent Appalachia, and it's an interesting program that's moving forward, and we're looking for its success to happen within the next few years.
Thank you.
I'll just add that Reimagine Appalachia has a website that is very informative if people want to go there.
Yeah, it got dropped in the chat box, so it's in there.
Good.
Yeah. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of the participants for your questions. Again, this has been recorded, and we're recording the questions in the chat box too. And so I'm going to pass it over to Heaven once again to close. Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight. Even an hour and a half in, we still have 83 participants on the call, so that's really impressive. I really want to thank you all for listening to the stories that you heard here today, and to not forget them as we move forward. We obviously have a lot of questions, and folks deserve answers to what's happening in their backyards and in their communities. This isn't just a pipeline bringing gas to your house for heat. This isn't just a gathering line. This is a massive pressurized pipeline. Someone has to take responsibility for making sure this is safe and making sure we can all feel comfortable in our homes and across our communities. So we're asking PHMSA to be our advocates, to be transparent with us, and to keep us all in the loop as they continue to investigate Shell and hold them accountable down the line. So we just dropped the petition again in the chat. Please take a look at that. We'll share it on our Facebook page, I'm sure, and across our individual pages. So please don't hesitate to sign the petition. And thank you again for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.